What might it look like to reclaim women's experience in the Christian tradition? Feminist scholars rightly warn against a naive nostalgia about a perfect egalitarianism in the beginning of the Jesus tradition that was then corrupted by the patriarchy. Instead, scholars such as Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza invite us to consider that there has always been an ongoing struggle for equality and community against domination and control. If that is the case, how should we adjudicate between all the incredibly diverse and conflicting claims that individuals and groups make about Jesus and the Christian tradition? Melanie Johnson de Beaufray, a student of Schussler-Fiorenza, argues that the criteria for choosing should be a pragmatic one. If the way someone is teaching and practicing Christianity contributes toward the, quote, liberation and dignity of all people, then we should support it. Conversely, if the way someone is teaching and practicing Christianity leads to domination and control, especially of individual men over women or over historically oppressed groups, we should oppose it. To use a Buddhist metaphor along these lines, arguably the greatest error in the Christian tradition has been mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. When we look at Jesus' own life and teachings, as opposed to the ways he was deified by others after his death, we don't see Jesus pointing to the importance of his own person or the significance of his future martyrdom. Rather, in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the canonical Gospels, we read, quote, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. The good news Jesus is proclaiming is not that he is going to die on the cross in a few years. Instead, he is pointing beyond himself to what he called the kingdom of God, or what we can call the beloved community, following the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But far too often, the Christian tradition has stumbled over the identity of Jesus or made an idol of the Bible, thereby confusing the pointing finger with the moon, when the most important point has never been either Jesus or the Bible, but rather how both Jesus and Scripture point us away from ourselves and our narcissism and redirects us toward the beloved community. Here in the 21st century, our challenge is to refocus attention away from all the debates about the identity of Jesus, who is ultimately just one individual male. Remind us that salvation is much less about what anyone believes about what happened 2,000 years ago, and much more about whether you seek justice, kindness, and compassion here and now. And turn our attention toward the building of a diverse, multicultural, beloved community that dares to transgress traditional boundaries of race, gender, sexuality, and class. As we enter into the minute of silence to follow, how do you feel led to contribute toward the hard, risky, but vital work of building a beloved community?
My sermon is inspired by a book titled The Meaning of Mary Magdalene by the Episcopal priest and contemporary mystic Cynthia Bourgeault. I'm a fan in general of her many books, so I encourage you to check it out if this sermon leaves you curious to learn more either about this book or various sort of mystical interpretations of the Christian tradition. Bourgeault is equally interested in what historical, critical, academic scholarship has to say about Mary Magdalene or otherwise, and kind of regardless of all that, she's really interested in the archetype of Mary Magdalene and why that's continued to capture the imagination and result in kind of profound spiritual experiences for folks. You could say that there's something about Mary Magdalene. Many of you will remember, we're not going to talk about that movie. Many of you will remember a little over 2 decades ago in 2003 when Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code landed like a bomb on bookstores and sold 81 million copies. That's not even to mention all the money he must have made from the film rights. How many of you read that book? Yeah, you and the rest of the world, right? I personally found it to be a pretty propulsive page turner and beach read, but it is solidly in the fiction category. I do not have time to debate the many, many factual problems with that book, but if you're interested in that, the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, he teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, has written a really interesting book called Truth and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code. A historian reveals what we really know about Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Constantine. I'm old enough, however, to remember an even bigger controversy that broke out in 1988 when Martin Scorsese released his screen adaptation of Nikos Kazantzakis' novel, The Last Temptation of Christ. How many of you remember that? All right. How many of you read the book? Okay. Saw them film? All right, see, less bright. This is like the art. It's a lot artsier than the Da Vinci Code. I was 10 years old at the time that this came out, and my father owned a video rental business. When that film was released on VHS, local pastors in our hometown of Florence, South Carolina, paid us a visit and petitioned my dad to remove this film from the video store shelves because they perceived it as offensive. Although I cannot remember a single time that my father darkened the doors of any church, I remember that he capitulated to the protests of these conservative religious leaders without a lot of argument. When I asked him why, he said, "I try to choose my battles wisely, and this one just isn't worth it." For whatever reason, however, he didn't throw the film away. The VHS tape of that film pulled from the store shelves, it sat for many years in the cabinet underneath the TV in my family's den. I really was not particularly interested in it. I don't know that I knew that much about it. I might have been if I'd known more about what was in the film. But a decade later, during my sophomore year of college, as my personal quest for the historical Jesus was beginning in earnest, I was home on break and I happened to stumble upon this title, and I finally popped it into the VCR. The most provocative part is when Jesus undergoes, of course, the titular last temptation. As he's being crucified, he envisions himself coming down from the cross, marrying Mary Magdalene, and creating a family with her. At the end of the film, it's shown that it's just a vision, it's just a temptation, and he overcomes it. And but Jesus he overcomes, I guess I would say, choosing the domestic life over the martyr's death. But to many Christian conservatives, the idea it wasn't enough that Jesus had the vision and overcame it. It was it was terrible, heretical, and too potentially damaging to people's faith to think that Jesus had had any temptation at all, especially that scene in which Jesus fantasizes about consummating his marriage to Mary Magdalene. As a young college student, a religion and philosophy double major, in the full throes of trying to break the shackles of my Southern Baptist, theologically conservative upbringing, I found this film to be a fascinating speculation about what it means that Jesus, like the rest of us, was fully human, including having a sexuality. I couldn't help myself from thinking that maybe the last temptation of Christ might be better renamed the best temptation of Christ. But theologically conservative religious traditions often uphold the ideal as celibate monasticism, and any other way of being religious is considered lesser than and a compromise. In contrast, many religious progressives have argued that human relationship can be an equally transformative sacred path. If someone is called to practice celibacy, of course that path can be transformative and profound. But so too can relationships, marriage, and parenting. Has everyone ever been challenged by marriage, relationships, or parenting? As someone who is both an authorized meditation teacher and the parent of an almost 18-month-old, I promise you that children can challenge your spirituality just as much as any Zen master. And although I think that the historical evidence is strongly against Jesus being married, it is possible that if the Romans had not executed him for insurrection, maybe he might have married Mary Magdalene or someone else at some point and had children. And a whole new set of teachings might have emerged from that bond and that series of relationships over time. As anyone who has ever been in a long-term relationship can attest, Jesus' teaching to love your neighbor, that's a whole lot easier in the abstract and in the short term compared to loving one particular person day after day for the rest of your life. Jesus, of course, is a profound wisdom teacher, and there is tremendous value in many aspects of his life. But we also need to remember that Jesus was itinerant. He was constantly on the move. For anyone in the trenches of a commitment to love another person for decades or to parent one or more little humans day after day, Jesus, who died tragically young and single around the age of 30, is honestly neither our best marriage counselor nor our best resource for parenting advice. You know, I think about that story for all ages that Layla told us earlier about delicioso and making tamales. And I think about like, what's in between the lines of that story? You know, the hours the tamales was taking to cook and the arguments the kids were getting in because they were hangry and trying to keep the young kids away from the oven while it's cooking and, you know, like having to keep your spirituality together through all that. Jesus didn't have to deal with that, right? That's the kind of stuff that he can't help us with, nor the profound joy that can come from passing on a family recipe to your children and your grandchildren, right? That's just not the stuff that he's equipped to help us with. The poet William Blake said it this way more than 2 centuries ago. The Bible must be shaken upside down to truly reveal all of its secrets. The priests have censored and clipped and mangled. They give us a celibate Jesus born of a virgin without the slightest stain of sexual contact, which is blasphemous nonsense, according to Blake. I love that what Blake deems blasphemous is not Mary Magdalene as the last or best temptation of Christ. For Blake, the blasphemy is neutering the historical Jesus. I invite you to consider that a big part of this consistent fascination with Mary Magdalene through the centuries is because she reminds us of this huge shadow side of the Christian tradition, the repression of both women's experience in particular and of sexuality in general. Relatedly, during the 10:30 middle hour on first and third Sundays, we're studying the college textbook Comparing Religions. It's by Jeffrey Kripal, who's one of my favorite religion scholars. He teaches at Rice University in Houston. Kripal has written about his personal experience of what we might call, again, the last or best temptation of Christ. Similar to the various fictional works that imagine, it's not just Dan Brown, right? You know, you showed us Jesus Christ Superstar earlier, so there's various examples of this, that imagine Jesus escaping his crucifixion to start a family with Mary Magdalene. Kripal, while he was in seminary to become a Roman Catholic priest, had this powerful dream in which he was swimming, and he had to choose, which side of the river am I going to swim to? On one side was Jesus, on the other side was a beautiful woman. The dream forced him to confront that his sexuality was a central and inextricable part of his deepest self. But given the current and remaining symbolic and institutional system of Roman Catholicism, which permits only celibate males to ascend to the highest echelons of religious leadership, he saw his choice as starkly drawn between a celibate religious or secular heterosexual life. Here we can see that long shadow of the repressed Magdalene archetype within the Christian tradition. There was no room, Kripal felt, for his full self as a self-described active heterosexual male within a Roman Catholic seminary. Accordingly, he wrote in his journal, "This is just perfect. I'm caught between a sexless virgin and a homoerotic Jesus." And I don't quote that last line to be offensive. Rather, I'm trying to invite us to really seriously take a step back and consider the dynamics of the Christian tradition with all that we know about modern psychoanalysis. From a post-Freudian perspective, Kripal's dream was his unconscious, confronting him with an aspect of himself that he had been repressing, what Freud called sublimation. As Mark Jordan, who grew up gay and Catholic and is now a professor of Christian thought at Harvard University, he's written this: "There is a paradox created by an officially homophobic religion in which an all-male clergy regularly sacrifices male flesh before images of God as an almost naked man." Officially homophobic, but lots of emphasis on this mostly naked man with ripped abs. And anyway, there's a lot to say about this. Many more examples that I could give at another time, particularly in the writings of the Christian mystics through the ages. And it's really interesting, again, to see how like the female religious mystics related to Jesus, to the naked Jesus in one way, in kind of a more heterosexual way, and the male mystics in a more homoerotic way. I mean, this is very explicit in the tradition if you read it. For now, suffice it to say that if we take a step back to observe the religious landscape, there are unconscious psychosexual dynamics at play when one is part of a religion in which everyone is commanded to love God as the greatest commandment, but that God is always pictured as male. And that unconscious relationship to a male deity plays out differently depending on where you are on that spectrum of masculine to feminine, heterosexual to homosexual. Like, you then relate to that male deity differently. For Kripal, as he abandoned his pursuit of the priesthood and moved toward academia, his scholarship led him to a study of the Hindu tradition, in which he interestingly found a strong component of embracing sacred heterosexuality, as can be seen in the Tantric tradition, in the Kama Sutra, as well as the very explicit carvings that are on the side of many Hindu temples. Who's been to India and can, yes, right? you saw some of these. Returning to our guide of Mary Magdalene, she also challenges us about how problematic it is, and Danielle talked about this in the spoken meditation, how problematic it is to put a single male at the center of a religious tradition. Such a choice almost inevitably leads to both sexism, the favoring of the male, and to individualism, where we just try to save ourselves or do it all ourselves instead of building the beloved community. The Orthodox reading of the Christian tradition is of an asexual Jesus passing on the mantle of leadership to a series of celibate males in this top-down hierarchy. But there are many other ways of interpreting Christian history. Consider Matthew 8:14, which says, quote, "When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever." Now, the last time I checked, the only way you can get a mother-in-law is to get married. So if Peter was the first pope had a wife at some point because the first pope had a mother-in-law. Indeed, it is fascinating to note that in the final chapters of all four canonical Gospels, they mention Mary Magdalene by name as the first witness to the resurrection. Moreover, all four Gospels portray her in the role of, quote, apostle to the apostles. She goes and tells the men what happened because they're all cowering in the room, right? She's the one out there, out and about. Not only is she the first witness to the resurrection, but she is the first to announce it publicly. In two of the four Gospels, this is a charge to which she is specifically commissioned by Jesus himself. All four Gospels insist that when the other disciples are fleeing, Mary Magdalene stands firm. But why, one wonders, do the Holy Week liturgies rehearse and tell only of Peter's threefold denial, while the steady, unwavering witness of the Magdalene is not even noticed? It's just erased from the tradition. You might also wonder that if a woman preached the first Easter sermon, how can one possibly be against the ordination of women? The only way to justify such a belief, as far as I can see, is to cordon yourself off in a patriarchal bubble in which all interpretation is by and for men. But the role of women in the Christian tradition was never fully covered up or eliminated. To give you just one really interesting example, in Western Europe, over 190 shrines were dedicated to Mary Magdalene, and more than 600 of her relics are venerated. In Reformation England alone, there were 170 churches bearing her name. Indeed, to give you a personal example, on the living room wall of my grandmother, a lifelong Southern Baptist, were 3 prominently placed pictures. 2 of the 3 were traditional Madonnas of the Virgin Mary, not usually something you find on a Southern Baptist wall. One was all in black for mourning, one was wearing the traditional blue associated with Mary back when, like, y'all know this whole, like, blue for men and, like, pink for girls is, like, 100 years old, right? Because Mary's the one always in blue. Anyway, that's a separate sermon. The third, wearing red on my grandmother's wall, this is pictured, is clearly a Magdalen. My grandmother inherited these pictures from 2 of her older sisters. And to me, they're yet one more testimony to the search for the missing element of women's experience and leadership in the Christian tradition. And when my grandmother died, I asked for only 2 things: a small table in her kitchen around which a lot of memories were stored, and these 3 pictures, which are of the 2 Marys and the Magdalene. They hang on my living room wall today. Here's the way I learned to tell the story of Christianity from Christian conservatives. Something happened, I was told, in the life, death, and resurrection that changed the life, the universe, and everything forever. And as time passed, various heretical groups, the Gnostics, the Marcionites, there's this one true tradition, and then these heretical groups branched off of it and tried to lure people down their heretical paths. And you all probably know as well, heretic just means to choose. It's from the Greek root heresis. If someone calls you a heretic, they're just calling you a chooser. You're choosing for yourself instead of doing what others tell you to do. So people branched off, corrupting the one true tradition allegedly in various ways. But the more I've studied not only Christianity, but also every religious tradition, the more I have become convinced of what could be called original diversity. This is basically what it looks like. Like something happened, but then immediately you see like various people interpreting it in different ways and branching off, and it's a big web and influencing one another. There has never been one pure, true, unadulterated, unblemished Christianity. There have always already been Christianities, plural. Just as there have always been Judaisms and Islams and Buddhisms and paganisms and more. From the beginning, in every major religious and spiritual tradition, there has always been diversity and conflict. Where there are humans, there is diversity and conflict, multiple perspectives, different experiences. If you're interested in the details, I recommend Bart Ehrman's excellent book titled Lost Christianities, The Battle for Scriptures and the Faiths We Never Knew. There's a companion book called Lost Scriptures if you want to read the primary sources for yourself. Very interesting story of how all that stuff was found. A lot of it in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi, it was basically buried to keep people from keeping the Orthodox from burning it, and then we stumbled upon it in 1945. For now, as I move to my conclusion, I want to invite us to reflect just briefly from the perspective of contemporary Unitarian Universalism. Our roots are in the liberal Christian tradition and then expanded, through the Transcendentalists in the 19th century to begin including all the world's religions, as well as secular humanism and science. And we have grown into a way of being religious that I actually think Mary Magdalene would be pretty proud of. As we often say, we believe in deeds, not creeds, and that we don't have to believe alike to love alike. We're not trying to force everybody into one path. In that spirit, in a few moments, we'll invite you to sing together hymn 1058, Be Ours a Religion. You can start turning to that in your teal hymnals, but I want to say just a few more things before we sing. These lyrics were written by our 19th century Unitarian forebear, Theodore Parker. They're about the type of religion we're seeking to live out and bring into being together. And as we sing, I want to invite you to notice what it means to make the shifts toward theological liberalism that the lyrics of this hymn trace. Be ours a religion, Parker says, which like sunshine goes everywhere, not just to one particular place, everywhere, globally, cosmically. Its temple, all space, not just one special latitude and longitude. Its shrine, the good heart, every good heart, not just some good hearts. Its creed, all truth, not just one holy book. We heard some of this in our opening hymn as well. You'll kind of redefining a holy place, a holy people, a holy land. It's ritual works of love, as our new UU values and covenants say, and we'll explore this more in December. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. I think actually it may be, we're going to do it in February, right around Valentine's Day, actually. We're going to talk about love, love at the center. So keeping that in mind and just kind of reflecting that as we sing together, Rise and Body Your Spirit, let's sing this through twice. Give you one fast point of comparison. I know a lot of you are interested in meditation in the Buddhist tradition, and we see the same kind of evolution there of an increasing openness to like community that you see in Theravada, the earliest of the traditions. It's all about individuals going off to a cave and getting enlightened. And then you see what's called the second turning of Buddhism into the Mahayana, and that's about the bodhisattva ideal begins to emerge of actually I'm going to delay my personal enlightenment until I work for this, the liberation of all sentient beings. Then you see the Vajrayana come out and people start saying, actually, there is profound, that's where you get Tantra, for example, and you say there's actually profound enlightenment and awakening that can come through relationships, through everyday life, through sexuality. And then finally, you have emerging today what's called a fourth turning in Buddhism that's more about this kind of turn toward community and turn toward, Thich Nhat Hanh famously said, the next Buddha may come as the Sangha, as the group. So just keeping all that in mind and how these parallels echo between the world's religions, may you continue your journey into the rest of this day, into the week to come. Continue your journey with love at the center. Care for one another, care for this one earth. Do justice, make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of hope, of love, of peace or joy, that goes with you out into the world. We're different for having spent this time together. And even in this hard time, remember to look for what remains good and true and beautiful. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.